If someone were to look at my family from the outside, they would see an ideal picture. A successful couple, two well-behaved children, a comfortably furnished home in a quiet neighborhood, beautiful travel photos on social media, and smiles always on our faces when we appear in public. People often praise us as a model family, the perfect couple, and many even look up to us as role roles. But no one knows that behind that picture is a world that is slowly falling apart. We once loved each other deeply and dreamed of a home filled with laughter and peace. But life isn't all sunshine. Work pressure, personality differences, and unhealed wounds all accumulated over time, like small cracks in a wall. We didn't notice or chose to ignore them. Because we're still together, everything's fine, and every family has its arguments. Then conversations gradually turn into arguments, and arguments turn into silence. The most terrifying silence, not the absence of words, but the absence of listening. We still eat at the same table, sleep in the same bed, but we're like two strangers in different worlds. When my child asks, "Why don't mom and dad go out together anymore?" It made my heart ache, but I didn't know how to respond honestly. I remember once, while looking through old photos, our wedding day, the first time we welcomed our child into the world, our first vacation in Dalat, I burst into tears, not because I was sad, but because I couldn't understand how things could have changed so quickly. I didn't recognize the woman in the photos, or perhaps I didn't recognize myself. We tried. We really did. We went to marriage counseling, spent time alone, read books, tried to change. But sometimes the effort just made us more tired, because neither of us believed the other really wanted to save the relationship. The more I tried, the more I felt empty, like a person rowing a boat alone against the current, not knowing where to go or for whom. That was when I started living two lives, one in front of everyone, polished, happy, successful, and one that was real, confused, lost, and on the verge of collapse. I smiled a lot, but few of those smiles were genuine. I talked a lot, but no one knew I was dying inside. At that time, I didn't know that I was standing at the threshold of a completely new journey. I only knew that the perfect family image I had tried so hard to maintain was cracking, and I didn't know if anyone could mend it anymore. There are battles that aren't fought with guns, but with sharp words, cold stares, and the silent turning away of two people who once swore to be together forever. I used to believe that all married couples go through tough times, that arguments are just the spice of marriage. But gradually I realized that our arguments were no longer signs of care, but symptoms of a deeper fracture. At first it was just small things, washing dishes, cleaning the house, picking up the kids. But I don't know when it started. Every simple conversation turned into an endless argument. Every time I opened my mouth, I felt like I was defending myself. Every answer she gave felt like a blow. We no longer tried to understand each other. We just tried to win. And the more we won, the more we lost. I remember one time when I forgot to buy milk for our child, she scolded me all evening. I remained silent, but inside I was boiling. When I finally reacted, everything erupted. Hurtful words, tears, slamming doors, and a terrifying silence fell over the house. After that, we didn't speak for days, even though we lived under the same roof. We didn't look at each other, didn't eat together. Our young child seemed to sense something was wrong. She became quieter, smiled less. The arguments kept repeating, like a vicious cycle with no way out. I once thought that if I just endure it a little longer, things will get better. But enduring wasn't out of love, it was out of exhaustion, and it only made me more frustrated. There were nights when she slept soundly, and I sat alone under the dim kitchen light, my heart heavy. Where had our first love gone? The days we spent counting stars together, the tight hugs in crowded streets, the times we held hands through storms. Now they're just distant memories. Between us is a gap that words can't bridge. Even silence has become a safe way of communicating. No arguments, no shouting, but also no connection. I've thought about divorce, not because I don't love him anymore, but because I'm too tired. I don't know what to say, what to do, or how to hold on. Love seems to have been replaced by anger, blame, and disappointment in each other. Every day that passes, I feel like I'm living in a house with an invisible wall dividing us. We don't hate each other, We just don't understand each other anymore. I began to long for someone who could listen to me without judgment. I longed to express my feelings without being labeled right or wrong. But around me was coldness, not because of a lack of people, but because of a lack of understanding. I was lonely, even when someone was lying next to me. I didn't know when the arguments would end. I didn't know if I had enough patience left. But I know that if nothing stronger than us comes along, there will be no turning back for our marriage. And that was when, for the first time, I thought of God as a distant possibility. Although I didn't dare to believe it at the time, a small voice echoed in my heart. Maybe. I need something bigger than myself. I took the initiative to suggest marriage counseling. She hesitated, then nodded. It was the first time in months that we sat together in a room, trying to talk about our feelings, our pain, and why we were still there. The counselor asked what seemed like simple questions. Do you remember why you fell in love? I choked up, not because I didn't have an answer, but because it felt like digging up a memory buried too deep. We tried writing letters to each other, following the counselor's exercises. A hug every day, a small thank you, a phone-free dinner. At first, these things felt like faint rays of sunlight shining into a cold room. But the light wasn't enough to warm what had turned to ice. It only took one careless word, one small misunderstanding, and everything fell apart again. All our efforts were swept away like a sandcastle under the waves of unhealed emotions. Once after a tearful counseling session, I came home and mustered up the courage to say, I'm sorry for not being there when you needed me. But she remained silent, then went into her room and closed the door. Her silence felt like a slap in the face, making me feel like a failure. I knew she was hurting too. In her own way, she had tried to forgive me, had cried silently into her pillow without me knowing. But the wounds kept piling up until we didn't know where to start healing. We weren't lacking in effort. We were lacking something that neither of us dared to admit. We couldn't save our marriage on our own. One night, I left the house and drove aimlessly. I stopped at a deserted park and sat on a bench under a tree. It wasn't raining, but my heart felt as heavy as the gray sky. I remembered what a friend once said, some things cannot be saved by willpower, only by grace. I used to laugh at that statement, but now after trying everything, those words came back to me like a revelation. God, if you really exist, if you are listening, I need you, I whispered. There was no thunder, no light from the sky, but something inside me melted away, as if for the first time, I wasn't trying to control anything anymore. I didn't ask him to fix my wife. I didn't ask him to save my marriage. I just asked him to help me get up, because I couldn't stand anymore. From that day on, I began to do something different. I prayed, even though I didn't know if anyone was listening. I began to ask God to change my heart before I asked him to change anyone else. And I began to be more honest, not just with my wife, but with myself. I apologized when I was wrong. I was silent when I needed to be. I listened, not to argue, but to understand. But change didn't happen overnight. Many times I wanted to give up. Many nights I still cried. But something was stirring, weakly, like a glimmer of light at the end of a tunnel. Not the light of a marriage being saved, but the light of a hand reaching out to me, while everything else seemed to be slipping away. We were still distant. We were still hurting. But for the first time, I am no longer trying to prove who is right. I just want to be right in God's eyes. And that somehow is beginning to change everything. The divorce papers lay neatly on the table like a sentence that had been passed. There were no screams, no loud arguments, just two people who had once sworn to spend their lives together, now silently staring at each other, like strangers who had accidentally met in a strange cafe. I looked at her neat handwriting in the declaration section. Every word was true, but it felt cold, as if the years we had spent together had never existed. I picked up the pen. The tip hovered in midair. A part of me wanted to shout, "Don't do this!" But the voice was weak, choked by thousands of nameless wounds. She said nothing, just waited. Her eyes were no longer angry, just tired. Perhaps, like me, she had cried so much that she had no tears left. I put down the pen and signed. And in that moment, I knew I had lost something precious that nothing else could replace. Not just a wife, but the best part of me, the part that once believed in love, in forgiveness, in hope. I left the lawyer's office and stepped out onto the windy street. Everything was the same. People and cars bustling about, shops open, car horns blaring. But inside me, there was nothing but ruin. I no longer knew what I was living for. That night, I didn't go home. I drove around aimlessly. I stopped at an old church by the road. The door was open. There was no service, just a quiet yellow light inside. I walked in. No one noticed. I sat down in the back row. And for the first time in my life, I cried in a church. Not because I believed in God, but because I had nowhere else to pour out my pain. I bowed my head, resting my face in my hands. God, if you are real, I've lost everything. What else can you do for me? I didn't expect an answer, but in that silence, I felt something strange, a gentle presence, not judgmental, not contemptuous. It was as if someone was sitting next to me, saying nothing, just sharing my pain. When I left the church, the night sky was quieter. No miracle happened, but something inside me began to change. I no longer thought I needed to keep my marriage by my own strength, but I was no longer alone. The divorce papers were signed. That door was closed. But inside me, another door began to open. The door of surrender, of admitting that I couldn't, but that there was one who could. And that was the first real step, not to save a relationship, but to begin a new journey. I returned home after signing the divorce papers, not because I wanted to, but because I had nowhere else to go. That house had once been a warm home, filled with laughter, echoing with the sound of my children's footsteps, the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen, and the familiar voices of my family amid the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Now the house is so quiet that I can hear the ticking of the clock in the living room, a sound I never noticed before. I walk through each room. The bedroom still smells of light perfume on the old pillow. The wardrobe is half empty. The wedding photos have been taken down, leaving behind smudges on the wall like evidence of something that once existed. I sit down on the sofa, where we used to snuggle under a blanket to watch movies at night, share our joys, argue, and make up. Now I am alone, just me, in a room filled with the ghosts of memories. Every object becomes a silent witness to the breakup. I don't cry. I can't. There is a kind of pain that transcends tears, and I am in it. It's like a relentless wave, washing away the meaning of life, sweeping me away and leaving nothing but an empty shell. I pick up my phone and scroll through old photos. Vacations, my children's birthday parties, moments that seem like they would last forever. I ask myself, when did everything start to fall apart? Was it because I was careless? Because she changed? Or because we forgot how to love each other? I want to call someone, but then I hesitate. Sometimes you're too tired to explain your sadness to others. I walk into my child's room. The small bed is still there. A few toys were scattered around, as if the child had just left yesterday afternoon. I knelt down on the floor and buried my face in the pillow. This time I couldn't hold back my tears. I cried like a child who had lost his mother. Not because I was angry or regretful, but because my heart was breaking silently. I don't know how long I cried. When my tears dried up, I looked up. On my child's desk was a children's Bible. I don't remember when I bought it. Perhaps it was a gift from someone. I picked it up and opened it to a random page. My eyes fell on these words. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He is strong to help those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. I didn't understand why those words were there at that moment, but in that instant, I felt as if someone was holding my hand, not pulling me up, but simply reminding me that I was not completely alone. That night, for the first time in this journey of brokenness, I whispered, God, I don't know what to say, but if you are real, please don't leave me. No angel appeared, no bright light shone, but in my heart, there was a gentle stillness, as if someone was listening and was there, and I fell asleep on the floor of my child's room, in tears and with a faint hope that maybe things weren't really over. After that night, when my tears mingled with my first whispered words to God, something inside me shifted. very slightly, very delicately. But soon after, deep anger began to rise. I began to rebel, not at others, but at the very one I had just turned to. I questioned, if you are real, why did you let me lose my family? Why did you let me struggle in vain? I didn't say it gently, I screamed it inside, sometimes out loud, during lonely evenings sitting at the table with only a bowl and a pair of chopsticks. I opened the Bible, not to find comfort, but to find God's fault. I skimmed through the stories, and in every miracle, every promise, I felt a wave of injustice. You saved them. What about me? He restored their homes, but my family is in ruins. I began to search my memory, the times I prayed for my marriage, the times I begged my wife not to give up. And now, all that remains are fragments. One night, in a fit of anger, I threw my Bible on the floor. Then I cried, not because of the book, but because I felt abandoned by both people and God. I had heard people say that faith is trusting God in all circumstances, but I had no faith, only a broken heart and questions that no one could answer. But in the midst of that struggle, something strange happened. I didn't get a clear answer, but every time I rebelled, every time I questioned, I felt something. God was not far from me. He was still there, not condemning, not leaving, just present. One night I lay on the floor, my eyes blurred with tears, and I whispered, if God is not angry with me for blaming him, then please stay with me. And I felt a peace as light as a breath, not because the problem had been solved, but because I was no longer alone in my anger. I read the story of Job again, the man who lost everything and also questioned God. I saw myself in him, and I realized God is not only with the strong, but also with the weak, even when they are angry with him. I no longer sought to blame anyone, because I realized that what I really needed was not a reason, but someone to walk with me. An old friend invited me to a small group. I went unconsciously and discontented. After weeks of silence, when everything inside me was still in turmoil, I received a message from an old college friend. We hadn't seen each other in nearly a decade. The message was short. I have a small Bible study group every Friday. Come join us if you want. I stared at the screen, wondering why he remembered me at that moment. I was about to delete the message, but for some reason that night I drove to the meeting place. For no apparent reason. Maybe I wanted to get out of my empty house, or maybe I wanted to see if God had anything to say to me. I walked into the small room, where less than 10 people were sitting on couches and plastic chairs. They were singing a hymn, simple, without accompaniment, but full of emotion. I felt out of place. I sat down in a corner, arms crossed, my face cold as ice. When it was time to share, everyone took turns telling stories from their week. Small, happy and sad stories. But I was surprised by how honest they were. A girl talked about her fear of losing her job. A guy shared his doubts that God was listening to his prayers. No one was trying to appear spiritual. They were just real. Then it was my turn. The group turned to look at me, waiting. I wanted to say something polite and end it quickly, but for some reason, the words in my heart burst out. I just got divorced. I used to believe that God had abandoned me. I don't know what I'm doing here. The room fell silent. No one judged me. No one told me to pray right now or repent immediately. A woman gently placed her hand on my shoulder and simply said, "Thank you for coming. Here, no one has to be perfect." I was surprised. My heart softened a little. After the meeting, an old friend invited me out for coffee. While sitting in the cafe, he told me about his own journey, how he had been addicted to alcohol, depressed, and had run away from home. But God had patiently waited for him to come back, and now he was still learning to trust every day. I asked, "Are you sure God is real, or is it just something to cling to?" He smiled. "I don't cling to God because I'm weak. I cling to God because I've tried everything else, and only He hasn't left me." That night when I got home, I sat silently on the sofa. I remembered the faces of the people at the meeting. None of them were rich or looked successful by this world's standards, but they had something I had lost: peace. I couldn't sleep all night. My heart was racing, but I was also afraid. I didn't want to be disappointed again. I didn't want to believe and then be abandoned. But amid the turmoil, I realized something. Even though I wasn't sure I wanted to believe, I did want to get closer. And that was the beginning. I returned to the small group the following week, not because I believed, but because I needed to. I needed to hear someone say something different from the endless cycle in my head. I needed a space where I could be silent, but not alone. That night's group meeting wasn't anything special. We had a simple dinner together, then sat down as usual. The group leader smiled and said, "Today we won't study the Bible much. We'll spend more time worshiping." I wasn't used to singing hymns. I used to think that people who sang praises to God were just trying to lull themselves to sleep. But that night, as the song began, something started to stir within me. Even when my heart doubts, even when tears mix with sorrow, you are still here, calling me back. I didn't know the name of the song or who wrote it, but each line knocked on my heart, gently but insistently. The lyrics didn't promise an easy life, nor did they deny the pain. They simply affirmed one thing: he was still there. I felt my throat tighten. A tear fell, then another. When I could no longer hold back, tears poured out like a flood. I bent over, my shoulders shaking with sobs. No one came to comfort me. No one needed to. I knew they were letting me be alone, with God. It wasn't the pain that made me cry. It was the first time in my life that I felt truly seen. Not with pitying eyes, but with the eyes of one who knew how broken I was and still wanted me. In that moment I whispered, a prayer without form, unprepared. God, if you are really there, I'm so tired. I have nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to prove. If you want, please come in, even just a little. I didn't see a blinding light. I didn't hear a voice from heaven, but something warm enveloped me, like a hug from within. After the service, the host handed me a piece of paper with the lyrics to a song. I recognized the title, You Are Here. I took it, folded it carefully, and put it in my wallet like a treasure. Not because the song was beautiful, but because in my moment of despair, it was the door that led me to the one I no longer dared to believe in. That day, for the first time in years, I stepped out of the small meeting room and looked up at the sky, not to run away, but because I wanted to live. I used to think that prayer was a formality, like reciting a passage before a ceremony or repeating memorized words. Before, when I went to church out of habit with my parents, I also prayed. But like a machine, no emotion, no faith, no sincerity. But now, after that small group meeting, I returned home in a strange state. Not excited, just quiet, like a lake after a storm, full of debris but also reflecting the sky for the first time after many days of dark clouds. I sat on the floor in the familiar living room, the room where my wife and I had argued, where we had been silent, where we had shared tea when we were still in love. And then, without ritual, without script, I blurted out, God, please save me. That was it. Not many words, but they were true. And for the first time, I didn't pray to demand, to blame, to bargain. I just surrendered. I had reached the end of myself. I had no strength left to struggle. I had no arguments left to prove myself right. I had nothing left to hold on to. And in that moment, I realized I no longer wanted to be strong. I no longer begged God to fix my marriage, bring my wife and children back, or make the pain go away. I simply said, I don't know what you want to do, but if you still want me to live, then please come in. I sat there for an hour, not praying anymore, not daring to stand up. I simply let my heart open, let the tears flow, let all the unsaid words come out. Not in words, but God understood. That night, I slept a strange sleep. No dreams, no startling awakenings, just a deep sleep, as if my soul had finally breathed after days of suffocating in darkness. The next morning, I woke up early, no longer feeling heavy. The emptiness of a home without loved ones was still there. The memories of the breakup were still there, but something had changed. I was no longer afraid of that emptiness. I began to write down my thoughts and prayers. At first, it was just a few scattered lines. Gradually, it became a habit. I wrote about my dreams, about the painful days, about vague hopes, about questions without answers. And then I began to pray with the words I had written. Lord, I am tired today, but I still believe you are here. Lord, I still miss her, but I believe you are healing her. Lord, I don't understand, but I'm not giving up. These weren't words of great faith, but they were honest. And every time I wrote them, I felt like I was being held. I started reading the Bible, slowly, without pressure, and I realized that the people in it were just like me, sometimes doubtful, sometimes angry at God, sometimes running away, sometimes exhausted. But they weren't abandoned by him. One night, I read Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He saves those who are crushed in spirit. I burst into tears, not because the verse was new to me, but because I knew I was living it. From that moment on, every prayer I uttered was no longer an attempt to change my circumstances. It was an invitation for him to change me, from the inside out. I used to think that if God really existed, the first thing he would do was fix my broken marriage, perform a miracle, bring my wife back, remove the misunderstandings, erase the past, make everything go back to the way it was. But no phone call from her, no apology text, no prophetic dream, no immediate change. And at first I was disappointed. I thought I had been praying correctly. I thought that because I had surrendered, he would have to act. But instead of fixing my marriage, God touched my heart first. I realized this through very small things. One morning, while washing dishes, a chore I used to avoid and complain about to my wife, I found myself smiling. Not because I love washing dishes, but because in that moment, I saw how selfish I had been. I used to blame her for being cold and uncaring, but now God showed me that for years, I had only known how to demand without ever truly listening. My love was conditional. God did not condemn me. He didn't criticize. He just quietly shone a light, like light filtering into a dusty room. And when the light came, I couldn't help but see the broken pieces in my heart. I started writing an apology, not to send, just to release the burden. I wrote to her, to my children, to myself. I'm sorry for not understanding you. I'm sorry for loving you with pride. I'm sorry for leaving you alone even when I was there. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I am not the same man I was before. One day, I read the story of Job in the Bible, a man who lost everything but never turned his back on God. I saw myself in him, not because of his righteousness, but because of his pain. And I began to understand that God doesn't always rescue us from pain, but he walks with us through it. One morning during my quiet time, I wrote, Lord, I don't ask you to restore my marriage, if that is not part of your good plan. I only ask you to restore me, so that I can live according to the purpose for which you created me. That prayer set me free. I was no longer in control. I no longer clung to what was broken. I opened my hands and placed my heart in God's hands. That was when I truly saw him in the brokenness. He wasn't standing outside waiting for me to be good enough. He was there from the beginning, when I was angry, bitter, and had lost faith. He was in my tears. He was in the long nights I cried because I missed my child. He was in the sighs I let out when I looked at my wedding photo. He was there, never leaving. No, God didn't fix my marriage back to the way it was. He didn't restore it. He was recreating it from the very foundation, my heart. And to me, that was the real miracle. My whole life, I was taught that men must be strong. Don't cry, don't complain, don't show weakness. I lived that way, holding on, swallowing my pain, hiding everything behind a forced smile. Even when my marriage fell apart, I went out as if I were fine. I worked, I joked, I answered every question. I'm fine, it's okay. But I wasn't fine. Behind closed doors were long nights of insomnia. It was the prolonged silence in a house devoid of familiar voices. It was the feeling of emptiness when looking at family photos. It was the pain of having no one to hug, no one to listen. I'm not okay, and I'm exhausted from pretending. Until one day during a small group meeting, the leader read a verse from the Bible. When I am weak, then I am strong. 2 Corinthians 12:10. I had heard that verse many times before, but this time, it pierced straight through my heart. I burst into tears, in front of people I didn't know, uncontrollably, irrationally, just crying, like a child, as if those tears had been bottled up inside me my whole life and finally had a place to flow. After the meeting, an older man came and sat next to me. He didn't say much. He just put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, you don't have to be strong anymore. God loves you, not because you are tough, but because you belong to Him." I had never heard a man say that to me before, and it healed a deep part of me, a part I thought no one could see. From that moment on, I began to learn a simple but important lesson: to be honest with myself. I started keeping a journal. I wrote down what I really felt, even if it was messy, weak, or even unidealistic. And I gave all of it to God, not as a perfect person, but as a child learning to walk. I started being honest in my relationships. When someone asked, "How are you?" I no longer give a vague answer. I say, "Actually, I feel empty today. I miss my child. I cried this morning." And surprisingly, people don't shun me. They don't laugh at me. Instead, they share their pain. They've struggled too. They've worn masks too. We begin to heal together. In my weakness, I was embraced, not despised. In my tears, I found my spiritual family, not because I had all the answers, but because I dared to say the truth. I need God. I need others. I can't do this alone. I used to think that being strong meant keeping everything inside. But God taught me that being strong means daring to kneel down, daring to cry, to dare to ask for help. I am no longer ashamed of my failures. I am not ashamed of the scars in my marriage, because those things have brought me closer to God than anything else. I no longer have to pretend to be strong, because I have found refuge in the arms of the one who never rejects a broken heart. I sit in a quiet room, pen in hand, a blank sheet of paper in front of me. Many times I have thought about writing this letter, but each time I stopped because I was afraid I would appear weak, afraid that I would be misunderstood as still clinging on, or worse, trying to justify myself. But this time is different. I am writing, not to make up, not to bring up the past, and certainly not to raise any hopes. I am writing because God has changed my heart, and I know that part of my healing journey is to face the past with humility. Dear name, it wasn't easy to start this letter. Even though many months have passed, you are still a part of my memory that I cannot erase. It's not because I'm holding on, but because I need to remember, to know where I went wrong, so that I will never repeat those mistakes again. I am not writing to blame or analyze what was right or wrong between us. I am writing to say one thing: I am sorry. I am sorry for not listening more. I am sorry for the words spoken in anger that hurt you. I am sorry for taking your presence for granted. I am sorry for choosing silence or walking away when our marriage needed compassion the most. I am not writing this letter as someone who is better or enlightened. I am simply someone who is learning again, learning to love without controlling, learning to apologize without expecting forgiveness, learning to look back without being bound by the past. I do not expect a reply. I do not expect a happy ending. I only hope that when you read these words, you know that there is someone who once hurt you, who is bowing before God and before you with a repentant heart. If you have found peace, I am happy for you. If you are still walking in your wounds, I pray that God will heal you as He is healing me. Thank you for walking with me for a while. Though the ending was not as we hoped, those memories are real. That love was real, and I will never forget. May you move forward with confidence. God loves you, and I loved you in the simplest way I could. Signed. Fold the letter. Put it in an envelope. I don't know if I should send it, but strangely, just writing it down has made me feel lighter. I am no longer bound by resentment or guilt. I am not writing to change that person. I am writing to set myself free. Faith does not erase the past, but God uses it to write a new chapter. And that chapter does not begin with victory, but with humility. I don't know if that person will read this letter or understand my heart, but I know one thing for sure: God has read it. He saw every tear fall on the paper, every apology that was hard to say, and He smiled. Because this isn't just a letter to someone from my past, it's a letter I'm sending to myself in the past. It is the first step toward liberation. I did not think the letter would receive a reply. I wrote it and put it in an envelope with no intention of sending it. But then, after a few days of prayer, I felt compelled, a gentle but clear urge in my heart. Send it. I didn't expect anything. I didn't hope for forgiveness. I didn't want to reopen any doors. It was simply an act of obedience. I wanted to live authentically, to live according to what God was teaching me: humility, honesty, and letting go. A week later, my phone rang. It was a familiar number, a number I knew by heart. My hands trembled, my heart raced. Part of me wanted to not answer, but another part, the part that had been healed and made stronger, said, "Answer it. Don't be afraid." I pressed the answer button. "Hello." A brief silence. Then that voice rang out. "Are you okay?" The voice was still familiar, but this time there was no bitterness, no blame or defensiveness, just a quiet, sincere tone. "The letter you wrote, I received it." I held my breath, waiting, not knowing what to expect next. But the next words made me almost burst into tears. "Thank you for having the courage to write." No need for more words. Those 3 words alone were enough for me to know that a door had been opened. Not the door to return, but the door to forgiveness, truth, and healing. We talked for nearly an hour, not to resolve anything, not to analyze who was right or wrong. We just shared. We looked back on the journey we had taken, no longer with resentment nor with illusions. I told that person about my journey to God, about the nights I screamed in loneliness, about the hymn that broke my heart, about the first time I prayed with all my heart, and about how God slowly restored my heart. That person listened quietly, then gently replied, "You've also begun to find yourself again. You're not the only one who's hurt." Those words touched me deeply. I used to think I was the only one who had fallen, but now I understand. Breakage doesn't just shatter one side. It tears apart 2 souls that once belonged to each other. And in that battle, both are wounded. We didn't talk about getting back together. We didn't talk about the future. We just lived fully in that first conversation after months, like 2 old people learning to be new friends. Before ending the call, I heard a soft sigh from the other end. "Regardless, I'm glad God found you, and you let him touch your heart." I smiled, a smile that couldn't hide the tears. No, he found both of us, and he's still working. The call ended. I didn't know if there would be any more calls, but I knew one thing for sure. We were no longer enemies. I looked up at the ceiling. My heart was filled with an indescribable emotion. I whispered, "Thank you, Lord. You are continuing this story, not in the way I expected, but in the best way." Peace flooded me, real peace, not because something had been fixed, but because I had stepped into a deeper dimension of forgiveness and restoration. I used to think that forgiveness was an emotion, that one day when the wounds were healed enough, I would feel lighthearted and say, "I forgive." But that wasn't true. After that call, my heart was filled with a mixture of emotions: relief, regret, nostalgia, and lingering anger. I thought that a simple "I'm sorry" would be enough to erase the past. But as night fell, I found myself being pulled back into painful memories, times when I was hurt and words that broke my heart. I prayed, "Lord, I thought I had forgiven. Why is my heart still so bitter?" The Lord did not rebuke me. He gently taught me through a passage of scripture, through a sermon, through his own silence. "Let me be the judge." Those words were like a mirror. I realized that all this time, even though I said "I forgive," I still held on to the right to judge in my heart. I still kept a secret ledger, remembering everything that person had done, every word that had broken me. Deep down, I still wanted them to understand the pain I had suffered, still hoped they would pay somehow. But God made it clear, not you, me. Forgiveness does not mean saying that what happened was not painful. It does not mean trying to forget. It does not mean justifying someone else's mistakes. Forgiveness is letting go of the right to judge and letting God be the judge. I began to learn this. Not easily, but little by little. I stopped replaying their mistakes in my mind every time the memories came flooding back. Instead of judging in my heart, I learned to give it to God. God knows, God sees, and I give this to Him. The strange thing is, when I did that, I wasn't weaker. I was stronger. Not because I forgot the wound, but because the wound no longer controlled me. A spiritual mentor once told me, "Scars are signs of healing. If it still hurts, it's not a scar. It's an open wound." I lived too long with open wounds, but now God is teaching me how to close them, not by forgetting, but by letting Him be the final judge and the healer. One morning while praying, I saw an image of Jesus on the cross appear in my mind. I imagined Him turning to me and saying, "Do you remember when I was betrayed, rejected, and crucified? I forgave." And then I heard Him ask softly, "Can you let me teach you to do that?" I bowed my head. "I can't, but you can. Please forgive through me." That was the turning point. I stopped trying in my own strength. I began to rely on grace. I began to pray for that person, not because they deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry that burden anymore. Forgiveness isn't the end, it's the beginning. A light, free, and life-filled beginning. I still remember what happened, but I don't remember it with bitterness. I look back, like looking at an old painting, and see God's hand quietly weaving something greater than the pain. I used to hold on to the pain as part of my identity, but now I know I am not the one who is hurt. I am the one who is healed. If you are struggling with forgiveness, know this. It is not an instant emotion, but a daily decision. It is not erasing the past, but handing over judgment to the one who is just. It's not about forgetting, but allowing those memories to be touched by a love greater than hatred. Forgiveness is the path to freedom, and on that path, I am not alone. I remember once, after a small group meeting, the speaker asked the room, "Where are you finding your security? In God or in something that can be lost?" I didn't answer, but that question haunted me for weeks afterward. I began to look at myself, and I had to admit, marriage had been my idol. I used to believe that if I had a happy family, a loving spouse, obedient children, a warm home, it was a sign that God was blessing me. It sounds right, doesn't it? But the truth was, I didn't just appreciate marriage, I depended on it completely. I used to think, if that person loves me, I have value. If my family is okay, I am successful. Marriage, unbeknownst to me, had become the chair I sat on, to counter the emptiness, the fear of abandonment, the deep insecurity in my soul. And when that chair broke, I collapsed. God isn't jealous of marriage, but He is jealous when I put marriage in His place. He is the only one who doesn't change, who doesn't abandon me, who doesn't break His promises. But I forgot that. I placed unfair expectations on the person I loved, that they had to make me happy, understand me completely, and fill every void inside me. That was unfair, not to them, and not to me either. In my healing journey, God began to show me one thing. Brokenness is not the end. It is an opportunity to rebuild the foundation in the right place. I learned to enter into intimacy with God, something I had previously sought only in marriage. I learned to tell Him everything, even the ugliest things in my heart. And I was amazed to discover He didn't abandon me. He didn't condemn me. He didn't despise me. He loved me. I gradually came to realize a truth. Marriage is not the end goal. Marriage is a means, not an end. It is a good thing, but it should never become the ultimate thing. Because anything that takes God's place in my heart, no matter how good it is, will eventually crumble under the weight of expectations. One day I wrote in my journal, I used to think I needed that person so I wouldn't be lonely. But actually, I need Him, so that even when I'm alone, I won't feel empty. I cried as I wrote those words, not because I was sad, but because I felt relieved. I felt like I was quietly but deeply removing an idol from my heart. I no longer saw marriage as my enemy, but I also no longer idolized it. I began to learn how to walk with God every day as someone who was loved, chosen, and complete in Him. And it was in that completeness that I was able to truly love. Not to take, but to give. For a long time, I couldn't talk about my old marriage without choking up. Whenever someone asked, "Are you okay?" my throat would tighten and tears would well up in my eyes. I felt ashamed. I felt like a failure. I feared I would always be the divorced one, labeled and judged. I thought God only used perfect people. I didn't know. He uses the broken pieces too. Everything began to change during a small group meeting. A young woman shared that she was going through a difficult time in her marriage, filled with fear. She said through tears, "I don't know who to talk to. I'm afraid people will tell me to divorce or to endure it. No one understands." I looked at her, and I saw myself from a few years ago. I hadn't planned to share anything that day, but my heart kept urging me to, so I spoke up. I shared my story, not to lecture or boast, just to be honest. I talked about the arguments, the desperate attempts, the feeling of being abandoned, and then meeting God in the smallest things. I talked about the pain, but also about the hope. When I stopped, the room was silent. Then she burst into tears. She said, "I've never heard anyone share like that. I thought I was the only one." I didn't say anything else, just held her in my arms. It was a real hug from two people who had been broken, but not broken forever. From that moment on, unexpected opportunities began to come. An old friend called, saying his marriage was falling apart and he didn't know what to do. A sister in the church messaged me, asking me to talk to her niece who had just separated from her husband. A pastor invited me to share a few minutes in a marriage counseling group because they needed someone who had been through the fire. I was amazed, not because I was being used, but because God was using what I was most ashamed of to bring life to others. I began to understand a spiritual truth I had only heard in theory. All things work together for good to those who love God. Romans 8:28. Not everything that happens is good. Divorce isn't good. Suffering isn't good. But God can take the bad and make it good. He doesn't cause the brokenness, but He doesn't waste any of it. One day I wrote in my journal, "Lord, I used to ask you to heal me, but now I realize you didn't just heal me. You turned my wounds into doors for others to walk through, closer to you." I'm not a speaker, I'm not a professional counselor, but I have a story, and in God's hands, that story has power. I started sharing more often in small groups, over coffee, sometimes in a few lines on a blog. Some read, some don't. But I know that if just one person is touched, then my brokenness is not in vain. One of the most moving responses came from a married man. "I used to think only weak women complain, but when I heard you talk about your tears, I cried for the first time in over a decade. I was speechless. I understood that weakness doesn't diminish your worth. It's a bridge that brings people closer to each other and closer to God. Brokenness is no longer something I fear to mention. It has become a mark that I once fell but wasn't destroyed, that I was once shattered but was healed, that I once lost everything but found the one who never left me. And I believe if God can use me, He can use you too. God doesn't need you to be perfect. He just needs you to be willing. Your story, even if it's filled with tears and doesn't have a happy ending yet, can still be a light for someone else, because in God's hands, everything can be redeemed. Even though we didn't end up together, both of us were healed. I once thought that the sign of a miracle was when a broken marriage was mended and two people returned to each other, living happily as if they had never suffered. I prayed for that many times. In quiet nights, I still whispered to God, "If I could go back, I promise I'd live differently. Please perform a miracle." But as time passed, I began to understand that some things cannot be restored in the way we desire, but they can still be renewed by God in a miraculous way. We didn't reunite. I and that person are still walking on separate paths, not because we're still angry, but because we've grown in different directions. The old wounds no longer bleed, but they can't be erased from memory, and that's okay, because healing doesn't always mean going back to where we started. One day, I and that person happened to meet at a ceremony. Both of us were surprised and shy, but then we sat down and talked calmly. There was no bitterness, no blame, just two people who had weathered many storms, now able to look at each other with understanding. That person said, "I used to think we were each other's biggest failure, but looking back now, it was those broken pieces that brought each of us to God." I nodded. My eyes stung, but not from pain, but from gratitude. We prayed together, for the first time and the only time after we parted ways. Not to ask for a second chance, just to thank God for not abandoning us, even when we were both at our lowest. I will always cherish that person, not as a partner, but as a part of my journey of growth and faith. God didn't answer my prayer the way I wanted, but He answered the way I needed. He didn't take me back to the past. He led me into the present and gave me a new future. I have met a different me, someone who knows how to love without clinging, someone who knows how to forgive without denying pain, someone who knows how to cherish the old while still being open to the new. There is something very strange. Since the day I stopped trying to restore my old marriage, I have been freer to live fully. God gives me peace when I think of that person, and even when I think of the new person in my future, if He wills it. I am no longer afraid of being hurt, because I know that no matter what happens, God is my foundation. I used to think that breaking up was the biggest failure in my life, but now I know it was the beginning of renewal. Not everything old will be rebuilt, but what God gives us is better than anything I could have imagined. I am not writing this chapter to comfort anyone by saying, it's okay not to go back. I am writing because I believe that God is not limited by any ending. If you are in a broken relationship, know this. Even if that relationship is not restored, even if that person doesn't come back, even if you can't start over with them, you can still be healed. You can still start over with a renewed heart, with a living faith. Restoration is good, but renewal is more amazing. And our God doesn't just patch up the past, He creates the future. My old marriage is gone, but my heart is new, and that is a miracle. I walked out of my first marriage with a broken heart, but God didn't let me walk out empty-handed. Over time, He healed me piece by piece, teaching me how to live from the inside out. And then one day, when I wasn't expecting it, when I wasn't looking, I met someone. He is not perfect. I am no longer the person who was looking for my ideal other half. We came together, not to fill a void, but to build something more lasting, a new family, founded on faith in Christ. The day I decided to open my heart again, I prayed for a long time. I didn't want to rush. I didn't want to repeat past mistakes. And what surprised me most was that God didn't lead me back to the past. He prepared a better future for me. Our new relationship didn't begin with passionate love. It began with listening. With the first prayer we said when we were still just friends, "Lord, if this is not your will, please close the door." That prayer, simple, sincere, became the thread that ran through our new journey. We learned to put God first before our feelings and desires. For the first time in my life, I understood. Family is not just two people in love, but three with God in the middle. We didn't just seek harmony, but obedience. There were differences, there were arguments. But instead of trying to win, we sought the will of our Creator. Every big decision, moving in together, managing finances, having children, began with prayer. For the first time in my life, I understood. Family is not just two people in love, but three, with God in the middle. We are building a new home, not just with bricks and mortar, but with the words of God. We hang the Bible on our walls, but what's more important is that those words are alive in our hearts. We are learning to apologize quickly, forgive easily, and keep our hearts soft. I used to think that the first family was the only chance. But God doesn't limit opportunities the way humans do. He doesn't recycle the past. He creates something new. My current spouse knows my past and doesn't shy away from it. We don't try to erase history. We place it at the foot of the cross. He didn't save me from my pain. He walked with me under the guidance of the Savior. I used to fear that my children would grow up with the scars of my broken family. But God used this new family to mend them with love, patience, and grace. They see in me not perfection, but a father-mother who relies on God, who knows how to say I'm sorry, and who lives authentically. One day my child asked, "Do you regret getting divorced?" I choked up. Then I replied, "I regret the mistakes I made, But thank God, he didn't end our story there. I dare not say that my current family is an ideal model, but I can say this with certainty. It is built on a different foundation, stronger, deeper, more sacred. It is not that I love more. It is that I love in the light of God's love. It is not that I am wiser. It is that I know how to put him above myself. I didn't rebuild my life on my own. God carefully placed each brick, each person in the right place at the right time to restore and renew me. This new family is a gift, and I will use it to glorify the one who created it. I used to think my life story was something to be hidden. Broken, divorced, broken faith, blaming God. Who would want to share those things, the sad chapters, the failures I didn't want to remember? But then I started meeting them. A man sitting alone after a meeting, staring into the distance. A woman with red eyes, whispering a prayer. A young man calling in the middle of the night, saying his wife had packed her things and left. They were people I once was, and I knew God had placed them before me for a reason. The first time I dared to share my story, I trembled. I didn't know if I had enough to say, or if I would only make others feel more hopeless. But when I told them I had once signed divorce papers with trembling hands, their eyes began to well up with tears. And when I said, God didn't fix my marriage right away, but he healed me first, that person nodded, choking back tears. I realized my scars have a voice, not to boast about victory, but to testify that even in the midst of brokenness, God is still at work. I began to pray that God would use my story, and he answered by bringing me to the right place, the right people at the right time. I no longer spoke from knowledge. I spoke from experience. I didn't try to explain why my marriage fell apart. I simply shared how God walked with me through that brokenness. I was invited to share in a small group for divorced people. Each person, each face, each voice, so much like me. Some had been betrayed. Some were in so much pain they gave up on themselves. Everyone had a reason. Everyone had been in so much pain they thought they would die. And everyone was searching for a glimmer of hope to keep them from falling completely. I recounted the nights I cried alone on the cold floor. I shared about the hymn that broke down the walls in my heart, about the simple prayer, "Save me," and about the one who did not reject that cry for help. I did not offer a formula for healing. I did not promise that every couple would be reunited, but I can say with my whole life, God can save you, even if your marriage cannot be saved. For many people, those words are what they need most, a painful truth, but one full of hope. I began writing letters to people I had met, little notes left behind after group meetings, short messages. I'm praying for you today. You're not alone. And then others began to do the same. A circle of healing spread, not through doctrine, but through the compassion of those who had once been hurt. Once a woman hugged me and said, "I don't trust anyone anymore. But when you spoke, I believed God was still there." I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged her back. And I silently thanked God. Thank you, Lord, for not letting my pain go to waste. I no longer carry the shame of my broken past. It became a place where God stepped in and shone through the cracks. He doesn't need me to be strong. He needs me to be honest and willing. I used to think I was a failure in marriage, but God turned me into a leader, not because I succeeded, but because I was saved. Now whenever I look into the tear-filled eyes of someone in pain, I no longer fear or avoid them. I step forward and say, I don't have the answers, but I know someone who never abandons you. And when I say that, I know with certainty that I am doing what God did for me. I embarked on this journey with one desire, to save my failing marriage. I begged God to help my spouse change. I cried out to him to mend what was broken. I came to God as a desperate person, thinking that what I needed was a miracle for my marriage. But in the end, I realized what I truly needed was to meet God, not to hold on to a relationship, but to find myself in him. On the day I truly surrendered to God, something amazing happened. I no longer saw my pain as the worst thing in the world. I no longer saw the other person as the source of my unhappiness. I saw myself, with all my wounds, sins, pride, and despair, being touched by God. I used to think I was just someone who had been abandoned, but God showed me I was the one who had abandoned him all those years. I once saw marriage as my salvation, and when it fell apart, I felt like I had fallen into a deep abyss. God showed me he is the only one who never changes, never leaves, and never fails. I began to live with a new truth. Saving a marriage without saving the soul is still a loss. But when the soul is saved, even if circumstances remain the same, I stand firm. I no longer chase after the question, how can I fix this? I ask, Lord, what do you want me to learn today from this very pain? One day while reading the Bible, I paused at a familiar verse. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet lose their soul? Mark 8:36. Those words struck me deeply. I had wanted to regain a perfect life, family, image, reputation. But God asked, you could spend your whole life chasing after that and never truly know me. At that moment, I understood. God had used my brokenness to awaken my soul. I no longer dreamed of a family like before. I began to build my life on a different foundation. Prayer was no longer about asking him to do my will. It was about learning to listen to his voice. God became the first place I ran to, not the last. The Bible became my daily bread, not just words of comfort. Faith became my foundation, not just a lifeline when life sank. I remember one late night, kneeling alone in the corner of my old room, I said, I don't understand why everything had to break like this, but if it helps me know you, then I thank you. I said those words with tears, but my heart was at peace. Today, I am still a divorced person. I still carry memories that are not easy to forget, but I am not the same person I was before. I am a person renewed by God, not by an external miracle, but by an internal resurrection. And I know this, meeting God, that's what I needed most. This journey began because I wanted to hold on to someone, but it ended with me being held by someone who never let go. I no longer need a happy ending like I once imagined, because God is the best ending to any story, even a broken life. If you are where I once stood, amid tears, turmoil, and despair, know that there is a voice calling you, not just to save your marriage, but to save your soul. And when you meet him, you will understand, as I have understood, God is all you truly need. I began this journey with a bleeding heart, clinging to the pain of a broken marriage I once thought was forever. I went through long days of loneliness, nights filled with tears, and moments so empty I didn't know who I was anymore. I questioned God. I was angry with him. I thought he was silent. But in reality, he was always there, never leaving my side. He waited for me to let go of my ego, my control, my self-rescue, so that he could be my true savior. I thought what I needed was to save a relationship, but it turned out that God wanted to save my soul. Marriage is no longer the center of my life. God is the center. I no longer live in resentment of the past, but in a new purpose. I no longer fall down in things that cannot be restored, but rise up with the belief that God can renew everything. I am living proof that even from broken pieces, God can create something wonderful. And if you are reading these words in tears, in confusion, or in turmoil, I cannot promise that everything will return to the way it was. But I know this for certain. If you seek God with all your heart, he will let you find him. Brokenness is not the end. With God, it can be the beginning of a new journey.